Thanks for having me again.
We are, welcome to the All Things Special About Education podcast. I am Shannon, the Executive Director at Kentucky IEP Advocate, here with Rachel Brown. We introduced her last time. We're going to continue our discussion about the consent to evaluate and the academic performance section. We got through the first three boxes in our last episode, and those were the reading boxes, which took some time, but reading is really important in all areas of learning. So it deserves time and consideration in your evaluations. So now we are moving on to our next check boxes. They're not checks. I say that. They're not checks. They're X's in our state. Math calculation.
Okay. So math calculation is just that. Thinking about when a student has to look at numbers, are they able to apply the correct operation? Are they able to look at, it starts off with kind of your basic facts or even just number recognition. Are they able to use correct one-to-one correspondence? Do they identify the number order? Those are your real basic level skills, but then it moves into addition, subtraction. Are you able to do addition without regrouping? So starting kind of your basic level, but then you get into more of that multiplication, division, regrouping with multi-digit numbers. Are they able to look at a step and say, okay, I need to, what we used to call borrowing and carrying back in the day, but we now call it regrouping with just addition and subtraction and going up to how many digits can they go to. You also just look at, do they start to understand percentages of numbers, fractions, really just all those different operations, decimals, like really anything that they would have to use paper and pencil to solve. You're looking at, can they do those steps that you need in order to solve that problem? It can look different for each kid. Sometimes they have different strategies, that have been taught in the classroom, because with this new math curriculum, you are learning all different ways to solve problems that differ from when we were growing up, and you just really learned all that rote memorization and just all of that. I've seen kids use just different strategies to be able to solve it, but they're providing the right answer, so they receive credit for it. This is not a time test, so I'm not looking more at that fluency. I'm just looking at their accuracy and how they're able to solve that. And that's really the biggest part of the calculation, is just really how did they work with those numbers and using those different operations. So if your child's struggling with that, there's a lot of different things that I'm paying attention to, like if they're lining up the numbers correctly, if they have to solve it. If they're doing division, they're using multiplication to get to that division problem, or, it's if they're using addition, if they have a multiplication problem that is too large for them, they don't know those numbers, what are those strategies? So you really are looking at, if your student is struggling with that basic math fact understanding, to go into these higher level skills. If they don't have those, again, it's similar to reading. If you don't have those foundational pieces to go into anything more advanced like multiplication and division with weak addition and subtraction, you know that this is going to be something that they're really going to struggle with. So you're really just kind of looking at what is that root cause that has led them to struggle in those other areas too. So you just kind of get all of that, and then just thinking about how to accommodate some of that as well.
Well, and so when we're thinking about like how the numbers go together and what you do with those numbers, recognizing that numbers have decimals, those are fractions, like all of those really concrete, objective parts of math, like the 2 + 2 is always 4, period, end of story. There, you could get there by drawing the picture and making the box and doing whatever, but that objective fact, like those math facts, that's the math calculation. That's what we're looking at.
That's what it is. That's straight.
So then the next one after that is math reasoning.
Yes. So math reasoning, we sometimes refer to as math problem solving, and it is really what you think of as just like the application of math. Really applies to more of those real world day-to-day activities that you might have math a part of. So just thinking about, again, kind of those basic levels, it's like number identification, but they are able to read the number, but do they know on a number line how to sequence those numbers? Do they know the order of it? Even just thinking about kind of those basic levels, you're looking at a basic graph. Can they read a graph? And can they tell time? Can they count coins, identify place value? Really more of just, it seems like it's math, but it's just applied in a way that, is more real world applications. Even word problems. Word problems are probably the biggest area for math problem solving. And it starts off where it's sometimes, if your student is able to do it with manipulatives or a visual picture, are they able to look at a word problem or hear a word problem and understand what you're asking them to do? So really just being able to understand, oh, I know this word means to add, or this word means that I need to subtract. Being able to pull information, what is useful, what is not useful. That's really a big part of math problem solving, as well as just those word problems that you really have to be able to understand the language part of it. So here we go again, relating to some of that language. When we think about this, like we were talking about the comprehension part, this is also another area that you would see if they don't understand necessarily what I'm asking them to do, but it's not maybe related to their ability to do an addition problem or able to do a subtraction problem. Do they understand the language that I'm using, that mathematical or math vocabulary? Or is it they just don't understand the word? So again, it just kind of comes back to that receptive and expressive language as well. You just really want to make sure that you are identifying exactly what is kind of that root cause for more of this math piece. And that's when you're looking at math problem solving or math reasoning and math calculation, you are really looking at, okay, I know that they can do 24 divided by 6, but can they do that same thing when I put it into a word problem? And if they don't, you can see that that is how it's like they know what that means when they see the numbers, but they don't know that based on more of that word identification or what is in that word problem. So reasoning, you just kind of think as more real world problems and how they apply that mathematical knowledge. So,
And the follow up to every kid saying, why do I have to learn these times tables? Why do I have to learn this? Because eventually I'm going to ask you in a story how to do this. And also later on in your adult life, these numbers are going to be here and you got to know how to make sense of them.
yeah.
And, a soapbox not for today, but that we have touched on is one of the goals of an IEP is post-secondary skills, independent living, vocation. What are we working towards? So maybe you're not managing your finances 100% by yourself, but knowing these numbers have value and that value is the money and the money buys things. And that is such an important real world concept.
And that's what we talk about a lot when I do these assessments, that it has changed so dramatically within like when I started to where I am now, of just coin recognition in general. Like kids are lacking that so much, and same with telling time on an analog clock. We are such a digital world that it's almost impossible. I'm always impressed when I have kids who can tell me how to make change or tell me the time on a clock to like a quarter hour, and I'm like, these are skills that we are just losing as a society. So that's like a whole nother one that I have. But even just some of that where it's like, is that related to a math skill deficit? Probably not. It is more of like, it is introduced and we talk about it and we teach that, but it is for us, we don't apply that anymore as much. We're just a very plastic society too. So, there's always things that you look at for that part of it. But even what you were saying, like real world applications of like, are you able to read a timetable to know when a bus is coming? Can you look at that like and understand, oh, if I get on this bus at this time and I have 30 minutes I need to get to this place, can I get there in time based on it? So it's just all of those different parts. And I mean, even just reading a map, I mean, again, we have GPS at this point in time, but knowing if this means that 5-inch mark means you've gone 100 miles, being able to read that, like those are all those things that apply to that. It's really even just understanding if you have that much on a map, how far are you going to go? How long is this trip going to take? But again, we're digital. We use that GPS all the time now, but those are all those math problem solving skills of just being able to apply that analytically.
And knowing that it is important to recognize the numbers, to attach the quantity to the number, and then you have to know how to apply that quantity in all these different areas. And obviously, as you get older, there are more areas to be doing that, which is one of the things that maybe we should kind of talk about now is what we had talked about previously with Robin was the general intelligence testing. So when you're getting general intelligence testing, that is telling you that your capacity for learning. It's reasonable that these test scores are going to be really stable throughout your school career. So that that isn't a test of the knowledge that you have, it's a test of the way that you think about things. So
Mhm.
then moving over towards the academic performance component, this does grow with your knowledge.
Yeah.
And as you do learn more things and you're able to apply more things, these scores do change because the responsibility that comes as you grow up and the expectations are that you are able to gain more knowledge and use more knowledge in a different way using your general intelligence. But something to think about is these, as you do learn more things and you are doing more testing, then it is reasonable to expect that these scores can also change because your the knowledge you're responsible to have developmentally will increase as you get
Mhm.
older with exposure and opportunity.
Absolutely. And that is a very good point. And when we do have students who, let's say in second grade, are assessed, they do meet eligibility for a specific learning disability in the area of reading fluency. What our hope always is that when we reevaluate, maybe in the 3 years, 6 year timeframe before they leave us to go to high school, and we reevaluate that, what we are hoping to see is that they don't need these services anymore. We are hoping that the intervention and the support that we have provided has been enough for them to catch up essentially to their peers. So that is something, it doesn't happen all the time, and it is one where that is a little bit of the reality of it, is that you see it's like, yes, you have made some growth, but you're still in a place that you need that support moving on to the next chapter of your life. For us, it's going into high school or transitioning into that next part of your life. But it is one where that is your hope as just the evaluator, as your special education teacher, as the parent, everyone involved. That is always, that is the goal, is that you want them to progress enough that they are able then to show you that they've made enough progress that they don't need the services anymore. And so that is something, it's always to be celebrated, even if it's, a 10-point growth, a 15-point growth, you celebrate that. Like you know, it's just it's hard, to see that sometimes, but like ultimately that's what you're hoping for with all of this and why you go through it. Anyway.
Well, and I think it's when you're looking at, like, that's the phrase closing the gap, that's a phrase that we all use and hear all the time, and that's the gap you want to close. It's like between you and peers so that you're on, grade level is another
Yeah.
thing that we hear all the time.
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
you're trying to close that gap to, are we closing the gap between your academic performance and your general intelligence testing, your IQ score? Are we closing the gap between you and your peers? Are we closing the gap between you and a mastered skill set? Like, that's,
Mhm.
you are the intervention that tells you that the intervention that you're doing is working.
Mhm.
The thing that can feel heavy is that you are making all of this progress, but also we tested you 2 years ago, so you're responsible for a little bit more now. And while yes, you have made this progress, is that at the same rate that the expectation has also increased?
Mhm.
But when we get to dissecting the parts of the IEP, that's where, looking in Kentucky, we have a supplementary aids and service section of our IEP. Once you provide that intervention and once you are trying to close that gap, not to say that you should withhold any accommodations at any point, but if the gap isn't closing in the way or at the rate that you want it to close, there are limitless accommodations that you can put in place to support reading, writing, math, all of these skill sets. So we don't just say, doesn't look like you're going to be able to master that, so we're done. You figure out a way to support it so that now these students have access, so that we're accommodating a skill deficit as if it wasn't there, so that we can then close that gap with accommodations.
Yeah. And that's, I think, super important. Right. We're getting off topic again, but like with that IEP part and like that data collection point that, teachers are providing, that is so important to say, is what we're doing effective? Is it making a difference in this child's education? And I think as a parent, just really being able to understand those goals that have been developed, how they're collecting that goal data, and what if you see that those goals aren't moving, and you have to give it sometimes. We know that, like, it's not going to be an immediate fix, but really just using that information to say, are we doing what's best for this kid right now? Are we providing that intervention or that service to the best of our ability, noting that they're not making progress with this particular goal? Why is that? And you, again, are just figuring out what is it that they actually need in order to learn, because it might look different than the other 2 kids or 3 kids that are in that class. They might need something a little different. How do we address that? So I think just, again, having that open communication with parents and teachers, and just really making sure if they do meet eligibility, even within that IEP, knowing it's a fluid document, and that is something that you have the right to say, you know what, I'm not seeing as much progress with this. Can we look at that again? Or even with an evaluation too, you see that sometimes with kids where it's like, well, we only met initial eligibility for a specific learning disability in the area of reading fluency, but I'm starting to see that math plummet. They are really struggling with this. Can we look at that again? So really just having a full understanding of your child needs, and just knowing where to go with that, I think is really important. And just like I said, just being, as you're saying, an advocate for your child, and being able to understand what all that means. Anyway, sorry.
Well, no, and I think we will get back on track to the rest of the boxes on here. But what I think is also really important is, as you have open communication, and as we are just talking about, this is currently what is happening. And it is not because you're a bad parent. It is not because this is a bad teacher. It is not because we have a bad kid here. This is objectively what is happening. That's the purpose of the evaluation, is to get the objective data, talked about the statistics and what that looks like and why those numbers are important. But what we're doing is just establishing the baseline for like where we are.
Yeah.
And if you put an intervention in place and you don't see progress in 4 months, then you pivot and you change and you do something different. There's no need to come to a table. Well, there's no need, number one, to ignore that and keep doing the thing that doesn't work.
Exactly.
There's also no need to come to the table and be like, teacher, you're doing it wrong, or parent, you should be reading more to your kid, or kid, you're not doing your work. It is simply the thing that we put in place isn't effective right now. So we stop doing the thing that's not effective and we try to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting and discussing why these things aren't happening and who's responsible for what does not get anybody anywhere with new interventions. It's time to do something else. Do we need a more reasonable goal that can be attainable, or do we need to be providing a different kind of intervention that is more appropriate?
Yeah.
Okay, back on
Whole nother
track.
episode.
A part of everyone, it seems like. Okay, the last three testing boxes, we can kind of loosely discuss the testing types, but
Yeah.
oral expression, listening comprehension, and written expression, those things go together a lot. So rather than
Yes.
trying to like really tease them out about what's what specifically, maybe we could talk about what would be an indicator of a concern about oral expression versus written expression versus listening comprehension.
So, yeah, I kind of, as I mentioned before, those are ones they do relate together, and you're thinking about some of that language piece when you're thinking about oral expression. When we're assessing that, are they able to tell me what, based on a definition that I give, can they tell me what that word is that I'm describing? Are they able to provide some of that vocabulary? And vocabulary is key for both the oral expression and listening comprehension part, because what you are trying to see for listening comprehension is, if I say a word, can they match a picture to that? Do they know what I have said? Can they make that connection? And with the oral expression, like I said, it's that definition. So that's the vocabulary piece, which is super important, because there's so much vocabulary, whether, again, go back to all those different subjects, you're learning vocabulary constantly, whether you're at home, whether you're at school, just in the community, you are picking up on vocabulary. And it is just seeing, do you understand the words that people are saying? With the other aspect of it, listening comprehension ties into even some of that comprehension. We're looking at more of the auditory component. So it's not reliant on the student to read anything. They are listening to somebody, which is, emulates what they're going to see in the classroom, what you see at home when you're just naturally talking to them. Are they picking up on what you're saying? So the listening comprehension part is, just that they listen to something and then you ask a question about what they've heard. If your child is able to answer that question, that means pretty often then they have strong comprehension, listening comprehension skills. But if you sometimes hear they're like, oh, I don't know, or oh, can you repeat that to me? See, when you hear some of that, it's where it's like, no, you can only hear something one time. Are you able to pick up on a majority of what I need you to hear? You can look at that could be an indication for some of the attention piece that we talked about. That could also just be general language when you're thinking about that too, where it's like, are they understanding that receptive component? So that ties into that listening comprehension piece. And as I'm saying, it's just like that auditory comprehension. Are they hearing everything? So if their hearing is fine, and it sounds like, oh, they just, sometimes it's that selective hearing where they don't hear me all the time. It's like, well, is that their true thing that maybe they're hearing you because of that selective piece, or is it because they're missing half of what you're saying? So you just kind of have to look at that for that listening comprehension piece. The oral expression is vocabulary, just being able to understand, to not define those words, but understanding what those words mean, as well as just being able to rote, tell me some colors, tell me some animals, tell me your food, just all those different types of things. Can they do that quickly? And that relates a little bit to what we talked about with that reading fluency piece too. It's just looking at that fluency, that's what we call that symbolic naming. Are they able to make that association with whatever category that is? And then being able to tell you something about those quickly. If you see that your child is, when you say, tell me your favorite colors, and they go black, red, green, and you just see that pause in between, you can see that they're working really hard to come up with it. They don't have that category piece, that categorical knowledge as quickly as others, because typically, animals and colors, kids can do those really quickly. But if you just see that as something that's a little bit slower, that's kind of that expressive piece as well. It's like sometimes you can see that word finding too, of just, it's on the tip of my tongue, I kind of know what that is. That can relate to some of that expression too. It's where it's like, oh, what is that word? What is that word? That's a lot of that expressive piece. And then the last component too is just that repetition or language memory. And so that could just be like saying a sentence back to you. Can they even just repeat a sentence to you and understand what that is? So, just all of those relate to that oral expression piece as well. But the biggest and most important is the written expression piece, because you can have a student or a child who is really, really strong orally, has a great vocabulary, is able to tell you all of these wonderful stories or sentences, but once they get those ideas in their head, they can't transfer that to paper. It is something where it's like, we were talking about too, where you have a kid who tells you a 5-minute story, but really when you ask them to write that down onto paper, they put 2 or 3 sentences, and those sentences are lacking the semantics or correct grammar, mechanics. And just thinking they might not punctuate the sentence correctly, and they might not have a capital at the beginning, but that they know those rules or things like that. And that can be really when we're thinking about its sentence construction. How are they can they formulate a sentence that's legible to the reader? Not so much like fine motor component. It's more of just, does it make sense? Can you make sense of what their writing is? But also, is it grammatically correct? Then you go into that next level of like an essay. Can they write paragraphs? And if they're, working at a level where in 3rd or 4th grade, you're kind of at that beginning stage of writing those essays. So it's more of when you get to those older grades that you want to see, multiple paragraphs with details. The organization is there. They're using transition words. So you're just looking at more complex things. So if your child is really, and the big part too, when we think about writing and how it relates to reading, those two go together just hand in hand. So when we think about those basic reading skills, that decoding, we also have to think about encoding, which is spelling, and how if your child is struggling with those decoding skills, most of the time they are also going to struggle with the encoding and that spelling. And that is one of those things where they don't always on assessments. I do have to say some assessments will say, don't look at any of those mechanics. You're looking at capitalization, you're looking at punctuation, you're not looking at spelling. But when I'm assessing it, I'm not scoring on that, but I am still observing, can they spell these words? Does their decoding and their encoding line up? Am I seeing that they're struggling in both areas? And to me, when I see both of those, that's why I think it's really important to have reading assessments, but you're also looking at writing because they're just so related that it's one with like, if you are struggling in one, most likely you're going to struggle in that other, just in a different capacity. And once your decoding becomes stronger, your encoding becomes stronger. So it's so related that it's one where it's like, this is just common sense. You've got to look at both areas. But again, not everyone does that. But that's writing. You're looking at spelling. And even for the younger kids, can they write the letters of the alphabet? Can they sequence them in the correct order within a time frame, and what does that look like for them? So that's really a lot of the writing component, is also looking at just the fluency of their writing. Is it something that you just say, it's like, oh, this one sentence took you 4 minutes to write, it's like, oh, that's a long time to work on a 4-word sentence. But, just thinking about even the language component too, that writing goes with your language. So that's something that, if they're struggling with even some of that writing, and it's just another level of communication. So language can also be considered at the same time. So, written expression, again, is one of those where it's really just providing a lot. You can do graphic organizers. You can look at just even our tech-based of using the voice to text. So there's a lot of things that we can do to school to accommodate that as well. But when you're looking at kind of what are those main components, it's really sentence construction, and even just writing letters and spelling at those basic levels, and then moving into those more essays and paragraphs as the rigor of school goes on. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
The last boxes on our consent to evaluate are performance, criterion, curriculum based test. I don't, I'm springing this on you because we didn't talk about it before.
Sorry.
I don't see these X'd very often because, and I wonder if part of that is that that's not limiting. So
say that's not
kind of
one that I'm familiar with. So
Yeah.
that might just be your state as well. So I don't
I
know if
have
it's more of like their like observation piece. Is that more of what that would be for them?
we have behavior observation after that. So and they are the different, like, are you going to use curriculum based tests? Are you going to use the tests that are curriculum based that you're using in the classroom as a component of this?
Okay.
Of course, that's how we got here,
Yeah.
is the academic performance. That's why this
Right.
section
Yeah.
is called that. And when you have criterion and performance based tests, like, those are describing the different kinds of tests that go in with all of those boxes above. So I have not seen that limit the assessments that can be done or
Okay.
open up any new assessment. I'm not sure if there would be a reason why you would pick a performance based versus a criterion referenced in any. We're doing
Yeah.
a comprehensive assessment that includes a lot of different kinds of tests over a lot of different kinds of material, period. So I think we can leave it at that. Our next one is behavior observations, which is how you connect all of these academic skills to what is happening in the classroom. So you can get some good indicators as you're doing this standardized testing and you have these numbers to be like, okay, I know from my perspective as an OT and your perspective as an examiner, this is what I expect to see. Based on what I just did here, here's what I expect to see.
Yep.
And are you seeing the thing that you expect to see? Are you seeing something different? Now we got to think about why that is. But and when we talk about, is this negative impact on education enough to be eligible, there are statistics that will support the enough. And also the classroom observations are a super important part of that, because you have to be able to say that there is a negative impact in class to be eligible.
And that's the point of the observation. And it is one, when I was doing these, I would do one before a student met me and then after a student met me, because I want to make sure that what I'm seeing is not swayed by the relationship that I've established with this student, and sometimes even that's academically a little bit harder. But when they don't know that you're there to watch them, there's a little bit less of that awareness of how am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? Kind of just that, I don't want to say confidence, but just the awareness of, oh, this person is actually here to watch me now, which can skew some of your results. So I think also just really important to note that again, it's all time related to time management of knowing and having that ability to go see that. But that is a specification of like, you have to go, if you think it's in basic reading, you have to go observe this in a basic reading time where you are seeing those skills being used in the classroom. You're not going, and reading is one, I think that is a little bit, reading and writing can be a little bit looser because you can go see that in science. You can go see that in social studies. How are they doing with that? But a lot of the time, if they're struggling with that decoding piece, I want to go see them during a small group intervention. If they're receiving, I want to see that. How does that look with, in the regular classroom and not just in our one-on-one setting? But absolutely right. Observations are super important. Just another piece of the puzzle.
It is. Well, and also why in all of our sections we have behavior observations. So that behavior observation that you're getting for the academic performance is not the same, although it could be very similar to the behavior observation for general intelligence. But then you also have a speech therapist doing behavior observation and potentially somebody observing adaptive skills. So one thing just to be aware of, equipping parents with knowledge, equipping anybody with knowledge about this is really important, but also kind of knowing what's reasonable and knowing what to expect and questions to ask is, we have behavior observations checked 5 times maybe on the consent to evaluate. And in this multidisciplinary report, integrative report, whatever your district calls it, we have 2 10-minute observations included. So help me understand how we covered all the bases here with 2 10-minute observations. And being comfortable asking those questions, but also it's reasonable to expect that when you have behavior observations with an X in a section, that section has a behavior observation to accompany it and some narrative data that goes along with it.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. Thank you very much for all of your information.
Always so glad to be here. So thank you for having me.
I will link the consent to evaluate here so that you can see the consent to evaluate. And then I'll also include a link to the company that Rachel works for so that you get some press on that, because
my picture's really old, so you won't see it. You won't even know
it's me. Talk about some people who've gone through some hair transformations. You and I.
Yep.
I will just plug that I think the model that you have is very unique and would love to see that, here. That'd be great.
Fingers crossed, maybe someday.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you again. I'm sure we will talk again about all the other things we said. Not talking about it today. We'll be back.